Hello, Global Theater. My name is Jerry Fialka. Today is November 7, 2021. We want to thank Rob Grant and his amazing podcast. I'm probably wrong about everything. Thank you, Rob.
Thank you. Let's see what you guys are right about. Take care.
Okay. So we're actually on live TV, which is an interesting way to start. It's just a retrieval of live TV. And Marshall McLuhan said that when kids like my age went to college, baby boomers went to college, we took LSD to replace being raised in front of the boob tube. So I think a good starting point might be Kenneth Anger's quote. And you guys could put it in context if you want or handle it any way you want, but I'd love to get how does this quote make you feel? We'll start with you, John. The day cinema was invented was a black day for mankind. Look at he's nodding. Yeah.
I know this one. Yeah.
Okay, so maybe you put into context and more so not what you think he meant, but how it makes you feel.
Oh man, Brian. I mean, it's just that's a good question. I don't know how it makes me feel. I mean, I think maybe he was right more than I don't know. I don't know how I feel about it. What he was. I'm trying to remember the. Do you have the whole quote?
Nope. That's
okay. Because he goes on, and it's more about like films being evil. He talks about and I think in context maybe he means entertainment is evil. And again, maybe he's not wrong.
That's good. That's good because you brought up a lot there. So Brian, how does that line make you feel? The day cinema was invented was a black day for mankind.
I'm perfectly fine with thinking that there are many black days ahead of us in terms of reflecting on our own self-image. I think, the ability to look ourselves in the mirror and to recognize that this idea of the ego is something that is a construction of the mind and of the perspective is something that needs to be shattered. And if cinema or any technology allows us to be confronted with our own, idea of ego, I mean, in a way, also, cinema reminds me, in Kenneth Anger's context, of the old description of narcissists looking into his own image in a pond and then diving in and basically committing suicide. I think the idea that he's getting at, that somehow we've sort of opened up Pandora's box through cinema by allowing some of our worst impulses to be seen, by allowing ourselves to, manipulate them in this kind of public sphere where others also take part in the process of construction. I think that that's generally a true thing, and how it makes me feel is that I've spent as much energy as I can in my life simultaneously running towards the camera and running away from it. As a researcher, I take great comfort in not having to be in front of the camera all that often, but at the same time, I recognize from an egotistical point of view that I want my ideas and my thoughts to be heard and received. And the reason why I don't spend my life in academic research libraries and institutions talking only to other academics is because I like the hairy thrill of trying to take my ideas out to the public. And so
let's hold there. That was amazing. You brought up a lot, especially because that Rob's logo is right over your third eye.
I know, yeah. I don't know which way to move at this point.
Just scoot your camera a little if you can, because we want to see your face. Because Brian, you're live on TV.
I know, yeah. Well,
I don't want to be on the camera. Yeah, it's like this. Whoa, whoa. But you brought up a lot there, and it really resonates with the Faustian, great filmmaker, experimental filmmaker and curator. He said we sort of make a Faustian, what do you call it, agreement or deal?
Faustian deal, yeah.
Yeah, with cinema, and of all people, it sort of seems that Kenneth has done that and articulated it. I wanted to go on two things you said. You said so much there: ego, mirror, and there's a document I really hope you'll read sometimes, and it's McLuhan's Narcissism as Narcosis. And it's a reinterpretation of narcissism in that we think we know what it means because this is what we've been told. And he says, no, when you look in, when the guy looks into the water and sees himself, it's really tackling what the object of the mirror or the reflection of himself is, that we're numb. Narcosis is numbing. We're numb to our inventions' hidden psychic effects. We don't know what the hidden psychic effects of cinema are. We try to suss them out, but in general, we just embrace it. Nobody goes, cinema's bad, That's why it's an amazing comment for Anger to be a filmmaker and say that. He's sort of like, it sounds like he's dissing his own medium.
Well, he has another side to that sort of thing as well, is he also says you can't deny sort of your baser instincts. You can't hold off human nature forever. You can't favor one side. He's like Luciferizing specifically is very dualistic sort of motifs, and it's about the human struggle with looking for the angel side and also not denying completely the demon or negative side.
Brilliant. Really good, John. I'm glad you shot that in, because it's exactly what I was leading to, is that everything humans invent have both services and disservices. So right now, all we hear is Facebook is ruining children, and it's horrible. And it's like, yeah, well, so did books. So did spoken word. Books were treated the same way they're treating Facebook now. These things are horrible. And then we grow up, and if you read books, you're smart. And if you watch TV, you're dumb. And now, what are we on? Live TV, and we could have done this in documents, like you guys type out words. So I appreciate that. We try to refrain from the words good or bad. We say services and disservices. So if he said, hey, cinema is a bad black day for humankind, well, how can I flip that blackness into lightness? Like Leonard Cohen behind, with every crack, there's some light, or whatever he says, that dualism thing comes out a lot, John, and what I've explored in your studies too. And I appreciate that. But let's go with,
I also just think Kenneth Anger is not really setting himself up to be a booster. And I don't want to put words in his mouth, but, it's not really for him to say, like, Hollywood is a great, place to live, and the film industry is a great industry, and I want to thank God and the Academy. I mean, I think in a way, like, he's not really trying with his movies or his quotes to somehow, like, present Hollywood in some sort of positive light, whereas as a form of contemporary media, it has the ability to create all this kind of social change and whatnot. I mean, I think he's almost enjoying the revelry of the fact that it does allow us to indulge in our worst impulses. And at some point, like, that can even consume us. But, that's a part of human nature as well. It doesn't need to be categorized in this thing of good versus evil or whatever. It's something that we can, indulge in as a way of like getting closer to the source of things. He also talks a lot in his interviews about magic as being kind of like the underlying force of the universe, the thing that sort of governs all things. And it's like, we don't really know how to use it as a technology. We don't really know how to use it as a force, but it's basically outside of the purview of sort of the way things are constructed, in academia or the media. And I think, his films sort of break that sense of stability that we think we have. When you see those films, they're really disorienting. They're transgressive in a way that they take you out of what you think of as the concept of cinema. The deeper you go into them, you sort of lose your concept of self, your orientation. I mean, I think that's what makes them so magic. And so he, in a way, is taking cinema to its logical, or illogical extreme. But
Brian, that was brilliant again, because we're going to get to magic in a second, but there's a great McLuhan line that goes, if it works, it's obsolete. And Hollywood does work in a way, and it doesn't work in a way. And what Kenneth did was he does what great artists do. They break the form, not the content. The content's one thing, but the form is, he says, I'm going to make short films with no dialogue and music emphasis and close-ups. And he truly stayed sort of true to the motifs or the tropes of experimental film. And I think this whole line, if it works, it's obsolete, is interesting to apply there. But you brought up narcissism in the mirror idea, mirroring. And I just wanted to ask you both, if we're looking in, we're doing the Alice in Wonderland, it's the looking glass. Then the glass turns into a mirror, and then the mirror turns into a door, like the doors of perception. So it's a twofold question. We'll start with you, Brian. What was Burt Shonberg lubricating his doors of perception with? And what do you lubricate your doors of perception with? And it's a general, you take it wherever you want. It's just a general.
Right. Well, we should probably introduce to the audience that Burt Shonberg is a painter, illustrator, artist from the 1950s and 60s who owned a beatnik coffee house called the Cafe Frankenstein, and produced a vast body of work that had to do with the occult. And in a way, he was sort of mapping the various experiments that he made on his body and mind through painting and drawing. And so what did Shonberg use to lubricate his mind or to expand his perception? At certain periods in his life, he experimented with pharmacological drugs, LSD, peyote, probably magic mushrooms. He definitely pushed his body and mind to the limits, also from things such as speed, from likely experimenting with bisexuality, certainly allowing himself to live in deep poverty and desperation. He was also living in the belly of the beast. He was taking on projects that were work for hire in Hollywood, for movies, for pulp magazines. He lived a rather, fast-paced and immersive life as an artist. And I think the psychological effects that had on him, and the effect that it had on his powers of perception, expanded the more he threw himself into these various experiences. But I think, the thing that he left behind to document those experiences was his paintings. And of course, the big question is where, where was he getting the source material and what did he do with it? So he went to, in the early to mid 1950s, to the Boston Institute of Fine Arts in Boston, Massachusetts, which is one of the most conservative art schools you could possibly go to. There, I'm sure he learned all about single point perspective and chiaroscuro and the musculature and all this Renaissance classical kind of stuff. And then he came out to Los Angeles in 1955, and he went to the Art Center of Los Angeles, where it was all about abstract expressionism and all about cubism and experimental art and, various forms of concepts and non-representational art. And so all this stuff is fusing. And of course, he has this really rich background of education. But then once it comes to doing these experiments on his mind and body, he's able to draw on those ideas and influences and things that he learned in school, but he starts to use them in different ways. So for instance, when he uses abstract expressionism, he's using skeins of paint, but they're not used for the same way in which, say, a Jackson Pollock or a de Kooning was, which was to create these kind of surface materials that give you this experience, this sort of disorienting, vibrant, rhythmic experience. With Shonberg, he's actually using skeins of paint against skylines and backdrops, so you can almost see figures forming out of chaos into reality. And so I think in a way, he had this background of being able to, mimic or pastiche the vanguard artists of his day, like a Pollock or a Salvador Dali or a Pablo Picasso. But from his hallucinogenic experiences, he pushed them into new territory. For me, I went through many similar experiments on my mind and body as a young person. I took LSD when I was 17. We spoke about that in another one of the talks that I did with you, Jerry. And, since that time have developed a pretty deep meditation process and also artistic process. And I think for me, the idea is to always take what is, I don't know, for lack of a better word, formulaic or something that the audience expects, and to find a way to break that expectation so that there is a transcendental experience. And in Buddhism, the one thing that they talk about a lot in the path to wisdom, or what they call bodhicitta, is that the more that you learn internally of the self, and the closer you get to your own wisdom, the more you realize that wisdom is reliant on others. So there is this relationship, I think, that happens, and I believe it happened with Shonberg, and I know that it's happened in my own experience as an artist, where in sort of understanding yourself, you understand the interconnectivity that you have with others. And so that's become, for me, kind of the primary motivator in terms of expanding perception. It's to, sort of expand both outward and inward simultaneously.
Brian, brilliant. So, John, what do you think anger lubricated his doors of perception with, and your own version too?
Yeah, anger probably tried a lot of things, but his main thing is Aleister Crowley. I think understanding his work is 100% just Crowley. And Eisenstein, also a big,
Wow.
part of his thing. I mean, I like speaking, I'm sure, being such a fan of Crowley, that there was mind altering substances or body altering substances, but the only thing I actually know he's spoken of is speed. And he said he didn't like using speed, or he liked it until it made him want to murder everyone or something like that, but yeah, Crowley, I think, was anger's big thing. I mean, understanding his work is very, Inauguration of the Pleasure Dome and Lucifer Rising particularly, it's just very explicit in those two works. And for myself, coffee is pretty much, he's not the first to say it, but the Zappa, sort of live normally and take it out in your work or whatever. I'm pretty much through art is how I just alter my doors of perception.
Pretty good. That was really fun, and it reminded me of something. I used to ask this question. Tell me your philosophy of life in 3 words, all beginning with the same letter. And I heard that Crowley's was cunt, cognac, and cocaine. Have you ever heard that? So this is a good lead in. We're going to get to magic, but we'll go with you, John, and first on this one.
Okay.
George Manupelli started the Ann Arbor Film Festival 60 years ago. Okay, so cinema's only 130 years old, so that's pretty good. His mantra is ignore yourself. Jonas Mekas, same sort of figure, important in experimental film, said there is no self-expression. And the great jazz pianist Cecil Taylor says, I'm just a vehicle and this stuff just comes through me. So of course it's both and it depends, but is art making, in regards to your study of anger, deep study of Lucifer film in particular, is it more self-expression or more Kenneth is a vehicle for whatever culture and technology is dominant when he's making it?
I don't think there's a division for him with particularly Lucifer Rising. I mean, he made it over 10 years, and with both versions of the film, I mean, that's like adds up to, something like 13 years, or, something around that of his life. And I mean, he wasn't messing around. I mean, he was living the movie, like making the process of making the movie was, him living his life. I mean, there was no difference, I don't think, for him. It wasn't like a really long, messing around or like putting off finishing the movie, which I think a lot of, it's like kind of an other side of the wind thing, I think, where he kind of had he created this reputation of like, there's this movie that he can't finish. And even though the book I've written kind of goes along with that premise, almost for being easy to understand, he actually had several different. He was always working on the film. Like there was always a version of the movie to show. Like the more he was always fine tuning it, and it's more like he finished it several times rather than he couldn't finish the movie. He kept working with it.
But I see it's almost what you described as you're saying he did what he got his life and his job as mixed up as possible.
Absolutely, yeah.
And so he was obsessed with it.
Well, his movies are magical workings, and he sees no difference. I think like life and magic, and create, like the act of creation is creating films is creating magic. Yeah, I would say, like, it is dangerous to put words into Kenneth Anger's mouth, but I think there's not much difference.
Yeah, no, we trust you. You've studied him, and you're not putting words. You're giving us. You're the vehicle for.
Oh, it is always the danger of the historian or researcher, to say like, well, I really know what Kenneth felt or thought. Is it McLuhan and Annie Hall? Where know nothing of my work,
he says, you mean my whole fallacy's wrong.
Yeah.
But you guys will love this. Woody had 2 guys in front before McLuhan, Fellini and Buñuel, and they both said no. So Marshall was the 3rd choice.
Okay.
And he flipped it because he made Marshall say, you mean my whole fallacy is wrong, as a statement, and Marshall always said it as a question. But it is, John, just to stay on Kenneth for a second, John, and I appreciate that. I know what you're saying. I'm not holding you to what I think. You're the expert. You're the observer, giving us your pattern. You're a comprehensivist because you've studied a lot. So I rely on you. But do you feel that Kenneth was reflecting his times? Like, I know that it's Crowley obsession and whatever else, but there's a technology, there's a culture when he's making it. How much is that sort of dictating, helping him, feeding in? I mean, it's hard to separate it, but do you, as the observer, see the time he's in affecting the making of Lucifer?
Yes and no. I mean, that's a good question because I mean, there's definitely a focus on wanting. I mean, he, again, I don't think he was messing around trying not to get the film finished. Trying to make it go as long as possible. But at the same time, he did want, getting Jimmy Page to do the score. I mean, how much more 70s, how much more of a get of the 1970s could you get than have Jimmy Page? I mean, he also dabbled with a Pink Floyd score. I don't know what some of the other scores were. Possibly an experimental score for one of the earliest. A experimental group that I couldn't track down who they were actually, specifically. But he was trying to be very of the moment, and that was very much of it. But it's also, he wanted to make it outside of time. He wanted to make it so that it was very much you could watch it forever or whatever. I think was the hearkening back to ancient things, religious things, philosophical things, so that it could have its own life forever. And I think he tried to do that as much as possible outside of the sort of like, but it's also still very much of its time as well. So,
Brian, we'll get to you in a second, but let me just follow up for a second, John, so we don't lose this train.
sure.
The next question is, can art making be egoless? And Brian brought up ego earlier.
Mhm.
So it's like you brought up timeless. You know, I really agree with Martha Graham when she said great artists aren't ahead of their times. They are their times. So, I mean, that's what I feel, that Lucifer, it has its time, but it's also an attempt to be timeless, especially with no dialogue. And you don't, it's
Well, it
got
was
this.
going to have dialogue. I mean, you can see that it was going to have dialogue, when you watch it. And it was recorded, though. I mean, there is,
Oh,
there's,
because I saw the lips move once, and then I thought, wow, there's no.
yeah, no, haven't I seen you somewhere before? I mean, it's there's probably a version of the film somewhere where they're talking. I haven't seen it, but it could be there.
But your guess or your feeling, can art making be egoless?
Personally, I don't think so. Mm-mm. Yeah, I mean, maybe even if it's the pursuit of getting lost in the art, but I really don't think you can remove, some art just exists without an author attached to it, because it has to. But for the most part, I mean, and I think that goes for the artist as much as for the audience. I don't think so.
Yeah. So Brian, in regards to Burt, same question. Do you think it was more self-expression or more a vehicle for whatever culture and technology was dominant in his time?
I would say that the most important thing for Burt was using his art to be provocative. I think when he came to Los Angeles, he was surrounded by people who were in the avant-garde, and he was also surrounded by the movie industry. And then through meeting Forrest J. Ackerman, who founded and published the magazine Famous Monsters of Filmland, Burt found a third way, which today we might call lowbrow, but certainly it was something where, the kind of highbrow, critically lauded academic side of art that was coming out of New York and London and France, to him, I think had lost its ability to actually like provoke, scare, engender a visceral reaction. And so I think that was really the main thing that he was trying to do. And I think, in the 1950s, when you're talking about like comic books and movies and things becoming extremely sterilized, on the one hand, this conservative conventional culture, and on the other hand, kind of the ascendancy of like critical highbrow media. And I think what Shonberg was really trying to do was show that all of this stuff was extremely phony. So, Ackerman introducing him to something like, B cinema or horror movies or science fiction, and giving him a gateway to sort of take that on as his subject matter. This was nothing that anybody that was writing for the New Yorker would ever be interested in. Not only was it not abstract, but it was figural, but also it was figural about subject matters that they thought was, frivolous. And I think Shonberg, in a way, was trying to sort of champion something that was outside of like the purview of academics and critics. He was, proudly wearing this monster as an emblem, so that when he started to adopt other philosophies, such as the occult through his association with Marjorie Cameron, and documenting his various hallucinations and his under the tutelage of Dr. Oscar Janiger with LSD, and under a shaman, Native American shaman in Los Angeles when he was experimenting with peyote. I really think, Shonberg was trying to invent a language that was so far outside of any kind of formula or standardization that it actually made you kind of reflect upon your own prejudices. And I think that was his big thing, was, sort of breaking apart anything that we thought was stable. And so most of his artwork, the longer you look at it, and especially when you see the larger oeuvre that he created, it was a cosmology that was, you could call it like self-centered or egotistical, in that like it stood outside of what was considered sort of the communal standards of the day. But I actually think, while on the one hand he was a really self-indulgent guy, and I think he was, like most artists, enamored with their own, breakthroughs of perspective, I think at the same time he was also really challenging people who came in contact with his art or who were associated with him to be willing to break from the norm and experience something of the wild, something of the irrational. Frankenstein.
No, good, Brian, because basically it seemed you dove into his intention, and this was sort of a question asking, and you covered it. Were these other forces influencing his art more than his self-expression and his own intention? And you sort of showed, that Forey was exposing these things, and then he was reactive or a vehicle for those in a different way. So can art making be egoless? Like you said, he had an ego, but can art making be egoless is just a general question to tackle now for a second. What do you think?
No, it's a terrible thing to be an artist and have relationships, friendships, because you have to be selfish, children or whatever. And Burt was as selfish as anybody, I think. But, for the people that knew him, he was also really challenging, a transcendental figure, somebody who left an impression upon them. And I also think the deeper you go into his cosmology and you see all the figures that and the experiments that he did in his work, he was basically documenting not only his own personal experiences, but also something of what the subculture was in Los Angeles in the 1950s and early 60s, kind of in the same way that Kenneth Anger was, especially with inauguration of the Pleasure Dome. The figures that are in that were people that were associated at that time with Aldous Huxley, Manly P. Hall. There was an underground of people in Los Angeles who were interested in the occult. There was a literary cadre of people like Anais Nin and Huxley and William Faulkner, who had become expats in Hollywood, got lured into the movie industry, started hanging out at the Garden of Allah on the Sunset Strip, and realizing what a phony enterprise it was. And so, while they were there, their minds sort of expanded into different territories, and so in a way, I think Kenneth Anger captured that underworld of Hollywood that existed simultaneous with the thing that the world sort of got to see. And in a way, I think Burt Shonberg did the same thing. It's like, here's sort of a parallel Los Angeles to the one that gets presented to the world.
Brian, that's great, because listen to this crossover. It's like the fact that we got Kenneth and Burt is amazing. And then Cameron. Now, my friend hung out with Cameron here in Venice, and then she starred in the film that sort of snuck into Hollywood. Like Al from Flipside says, don't sell out, sneak in. And, there's not really any experimental films in Hollywood. There's films that use experimental elements, but Night Tide's pretty dang experimental to be a Hollywood film. In a way, it's a mainstream film, and it stars Cameron, in Dennis Hopper's first starring role right here on the Santa Monica Pier. So I love this sort of commonality between these two people that you've both studied. And
I'm glad you mentioned Cameron, Brian, because that's really the link. I mean, between Burt and Kenneth. I mean, even more than Forey, even though Kenneth and Forrest Ackerman were really good friends, it seems like, and lifelong friends, as well as Jonas Mekas. Like Cameron is the link, I think, there between and Curtis, who did Night Tide, is also in Pleasure Dome. And she stars in Pleasure Dome, which is probably, I might, unless I can think of something else, I might say Pleasure Dome is probably the most experimental movie Hollywood is, because I think that was shot, right by Hollywood Forever in Samson DeBreer's house. So,
but I'm saying when you call it a feature film,
yeah,
Pleasure Dome is still considered
a shorter film,
experimental film.
Yeah.
But and it's a debatable subject, but it is this term you brought up earlier, magic. And so then we go to Arthur C. Clarke, who said any sufficiently advanced technology is indistinguishable from magic. So anything humans invent is sort of magical. Spoken word, printed word, cell phones, gesture, eye contact, gaze, all this stuff we invent, whether it's innate or invented is something we tackle often. And you can't tell just because we invent words, you can't really say if something is innate or invented. But this thing about magic, and you brought it up well, Brian, you said, Kenneth said that magic is a kind of ultimate technology in the cosmos. So let's just start with the word magic. With you, John, is magic more innate or more invented in humans? I know it's a stupid question, but
no, it's not a stupid question. It's just I'm not sure. I think I mean, maybe I just keep riding the fence here, but it seems like it'd be both, right? I mean, it's like, because things become commonplace that are astounding at first, you know, like just flight, getting on a plane and going somewhere. I mean, you know, we worked real hard for that, you know, and now it's just something that annoys the hell out of all of us because it's so annoying to do now. You know.
Yeah, you watch Gizmo. You ever see that film Gizmo of all the guys trying to fly? Well, was that some innate thing in them? Because us three people would probably agree to eat food is innate.
It's innate to try to do it, I guess. It's innate to try and keep making things more commonplace, you know.
But I don't know that it's innate to eat a lobster or to take a leaf and be the first one to say, like, I'm going to roll this in something and put it in my mouth and smoke it. I mean, I think there's a bit more intentionality to that.
Yeah, so it's, I mean, it seems like it's both to me, right? I mean, but it's like it was innate to somebody because they did it. And like, yeah, why would you do that? If you think about it,
right?
Why would
but
you do it?
I was going to finish, Brian, because I want to hear from you too. Is there's breatharians, so that then they're like, that's proof that eating isn't innate. It's like, well, can you live on your breath? Maybe they can. So again, words are limiting. Like T.S. Eliot says, when I talk to you, I got to use words. So we're sort of going on a collective hunch that the words we're using, we all agree they mean. So I'm curious to you, just back to magic, Brian, is magic more innate in humans or more invented by humans?
Magic with a K is innate to the cosmos. I think that is kind of one of the central core ideals of Crowley, Cameron, Anger, and Schomburg to a degree. And I would say magic without the K, or the illusion that humans can create, is probably more of a human construct. And there are times, especially in Kenneth Anger's work, where the two become sort of synonymous. Like Méliès, I think Anger or Orson Welles saw himself as an illusionist as much as he did a conjurer. The conjuring side would be tapping into something that we don't wholly understand, but through the creative act, we begin the process of understanding it. We become conscious. We manifest something from the subconscious into the conscious realm, and from the conscious realm into something that can be shared and disseminated. That's what filmmaking is. And to go back to like the original question that we started all of this with, I mean, in a way, that is Kenneth Anger, by working on films in the particular way he did. It wasn't just a shattering of a mirror or a shattering of self, but it was sort of that breaking of the taboo process of actually saying, like, I am going to go into something that could harm my life. I'm going to beg for money. I'm going to starve for this. I'm going to put out ideas that could get me blacklisted or killed. I mean, there are all kinds of risks in creating anything, risk of ostracization from one's family. And I think in a way, it's not just the risk of becoming famous and then being hounded by paparazzi, but I think Kenneth kind of understood that the whole industry sort of, in a way, maybe crystallized this dangerous area of where conjuring and illusion actually puts us out there in a way that, you know, leaves us sort of without a net to fall under us. It really does, on so many different levels, leave us, you know, sort of exposed. And I think his films, and maybe Schomburg's work to a lesser degree, explore that side of magic. And I think in a way, with Schomburg particularly, you see images of not just Frankenstein, but of Lucifer and Pan and those kind of figures where in history they're more associated, or Dionysus, with the irrational rather than the intellectual or cerebral or rational side of things. That's something that ties into a lot of what I've been talking about, is that, you know, formulas, criticism, these are things that are really kind of constructs of the rational mind of humans. But I think with Schomburg and with Anger and with myself too, you know, as an artist, as a writer, and as a filmmaker, like a lot of what I'm trying to do is get away from presenting things in an overly rational, overly formulaic, overly standardized way, and try to actually have something of a primitive or irrational experience where like the mind can actually live without those sort of comfort zones that simultaneously ground us, but also in a way control us. And so what it really is about getting away from the idea of control and allowing your mind to live in nature in a more free and open way. That's what I get out of Kenneth, and simultaneously, like I don't get that out of Curtis Harrington's movies. I knew Curtis, and I actually presented a slideshow of Beat Generation images from Los Angeles at the Egyptian, and Curtis showed Night Tide After. And I remember, you know, talking to him specifically about Kenneth Anger and David Lynch, and he said, you know, his biggest problem was that he could get a good idea, but he didn't know how to finish it. And I didn't, you know, I was surprised that he would admit something like that, because he did have a pretty large oeuvre of feature films. But I always thought that Night Tide could have ended after the first 10 minutes, because it's a spectacular short film. But for the next, you know, 45 minutes or an hour, it's totally formulaic, and it ends in the most predictable way possible. But, you know,
well, let's, Brian, this is brilliant, because every time I have an event at Beyond Baroque, I'll tell people this. Next to Beyond Baroque is the Venice police station, where the last scene in Night Tide happens. Dennis Hopper led out of the police station. And the angle is you can see the building, which is the old Venice City Hall in the background, which is going to become the oldest poetry center in the world, Beyond Baroque. And as the film ends, because Curtis, one of his motives was to make Edgar Allan Poe into cinema, he superimposes a Edgar Allan Poe poem over Beyond Baroque, like presaging that this building's going to be the poetry center of the world. So I totally understand, because you're actually someone who pays attention to it. I bought a copy of Night Tide at 99-cent store for 49 cents on VHS once. So you
overpaid.
Yeah, you pay attention to these films. You don't just like gather them, and you know, you're a deep researcher, and I appreciate that. But you really evoked this comment just now that Carolyn Casey said last week. You know, Coyote Network News, 25 years on Pacifica. She's the compassionate trickster. She said, freedom is gazing at danger. So I'm obsessed with this whole thing about gaze. Like, did humans invent gaze? And, you know, Nina Menkins is all into the female gaze now, or she got it, and they're studying that. And then there's the Zoom gaze. Like, I can tell you guys aren't checking your email. It feels as though you're present here right now. And you ever do Zooms where you can tell, you can see it in the reflection, and they're just checking their email. So there's all this gazing. But Brian, you must have ESP, because you really dug into conscious and unconscious, because I wanted to tackle this one too.
Hey, I'm sorry. Before we go on, I feel like I had to go back to way back, because I wanted to let Brian finish.
Yeah,
but magic with a K, again, kind of straddling that line. I completely agree about that. That's like the sort of innate, sort of an ethereal way that Kenneth's films make you feel. I feel like magic with a K, Kenneth would view it as, and his filmmaking as also being magic, as asserting like the opposite of being innate. He's asserting his will onto reality. So that's how his, like, I think that's how he would sort of speak more about magic with a K. Like Crowley's magic would be more like you're asserting yourself through magical means. So it's like the actual act of magic wouldn't be like, sort of like connecting to a more you're doing it through your a force of something.
Right.
Yeah,
and
and cinema as a language, the whole idea of a grimoire, it's basically a derivative of the word grammar, and a spell is literally just to spell something out. So you're literally using language to conjure something into the world. And so I think that, the idea that cinema can have this kind of conjuring aspect, is very consistent with the whole concept of occult magic in general.
Yeah, because his films definitely like pull you in and make you feel like you're sort of losing like you get wrapped up in them, but that's him working on you, sort of thing. And that, I think that's how he would sort of talk about it more, I guess. Is why I just wanted to like touch on that.
Yeah, I felt so stupid the first time I saw Inauguration of the Pleasure Dome, because I thought it was just going to be this fun opportunity to smoke some pot and go to UCLA and watch some experimental films. And then that film was really like a very disorienting and transgressive experience for me. And I felt like I was really losing my mind watching it.
Yeah.
And I sort of walked out of it and was like very like, needed fresh air, needed something to reground me, because it totally felt like it wiped out the ground beneath my feet. It was not the kind of film to, have kind of a loose, almost like, getting drunk or getting high with your friends kind of experience. It was something that was much more sacred, but also really challenging and disorienting for me. And I appreciated that experience so much that I think it caused me to look inside and say, like, what is it that I sort of feel entitled to experience, and through my education or cultural background or whatever it was. And then you have somebody that sort of takes you outside of that and says, like, you really think you're that smart, you should be willing to forego a lot of the things that you think and experience something a little bit more wild and primitive, something that's outside of your grasp. And I had never considered that thought before. In a way, I think ever since college, I thought I was moving more towards having a grasp on the world, and that experience made me feel like I had lost all grasp on the world. So I don't know, for whatever it's worth.
Yeah, I'm glad you jumped in, John, because I tend to steamroll and carry on, but I appreciate when people just say, wait a minute, raise your hand and say, wait, let's go, because I didn't really understand the distinction between magic with the K and magic with the C, so you helped suss that out. And it's back to Brian. My definition of great art is usually it fucks your shit up and you go, I could do that. So, it sort of fires you up and go, wait a minute. Like they asked George Clinton what kind of music, or I asked George Clinton what kind of music you like. He goes, I like the kind of music that I hate. So it'll make me figure out why I hate it. It affects you. And, this line when people get in front of their film and go, I hope you enjoy my film. It's like, please, do you have to say that horrible cliche because it's just the social thing to say?
Yeah.
It's like, no, I want my film to render some sort of experience for you. But the Harry Smith said the purpose of cinema is put people to sleep. So we're dreaming awake. We're sharing a dream together. Like Yoko says, if you dream a dream alone, it's a dream. If you dream a dream with other people, it's reality. So when you were watching that film at UCLA, everybody was there dreaming that together at the same time, unless they were literally sleeping, because that's what happens sometimes at movies. So I would love to tackle this. It's a question that McLuhan asked, but he didn't answer it. And it differentiates this idea. How about technologies as the collective unconscious and art as the collective unconsciousness? So it sounds like a bunch of jumbling bullshit, like McLuhan's usually saying, but it's like, what's the difference between art and technology? You know, these are inventions. This is the form. You know, you're using paint or you're using cinema. And then what's the content? What did you make with it? You know, it was even Ken Jacobs and Brackage went up to the movie screen and stood right next to the movie screen and looked at the screen at an angle right next to it. And of course the ushers say, please take your seat, you know, because they knew there were two things happening there. There's what's projected, and then the idea that you're in a room looking at light on a white screen. Same thing with book, you know, or your book, Brian. It's we're looking at these paintings in a book. And you know, I have to commend you, Brian, because you're the one who bought Passages from Finnegan's Wake for me on VHS many years ago. And you know, you can't make Finnegan's Wake into a book. It already is. It is TikTok. It's like Clubhouse. It's whatever's after the internet. So what's the difference? You know, you can differentiate between art and technology, but what's the difference, Brian, we'll start with you, between conscious and consciousness? So, you know, he's saying it could be that technologies are the collective unconscious and art is the collective unconsciousness. So just break it down to the words conscious and consciousness. How do you differentiate between those two words?
I never really thought about it before, but if I had to try to, you know, codify like the way in which I would use them, I guess I would use consciousness as something that is active, where conscious is more like a noun. It's just something that, you know, we're all, I guess, participating in. We all are, in terms of a collective unconscious, we're all participating in the collective unconscious. But consciousness, it seems to be something active where you weren't quite aware of it, and then suddenly you were. Your consciousness was expanded. So I don't know. I can only. I think
I want us to act on hunch. I don't want us to be.
Yeah, no, I know.
Yeah, that's just that was a great hunch, and I'll react to it. But I'd love to hear John. What do you?
No, I don't know that I can even. I mean, I don't think I can expand much beyond Brian's. I mean, I might be thinking about that one for a while. You know, before I got what I was like. You know, that's what I should say.
No, that's all right. Yeah, you don't. It's just your guess and your hunch and impulse. But it's amazing.
And Jerry, I mean, what I would say is that you know, the way in which they've sort of been used in the Jungian or in the McLuhan way would be like conscience or the collective unconscious would be something that is unpersonal, whereas consciousness would be a personal thing.
No,
that seems to be the general way in which they would be used, and that's how I would use them myself.
Yeah. No, but it's interesting because Bucky Fuller wrote the book, I Seem to Be a Verb. And Native American Indians, indigenous, some of their cultures have no nouns. Oh, they only have verbs. So I like that you said consciousness is active and personal and like a verb, because if art is the collective unconsciousness, then that's verb. And then if technologies are the collective unconscious, that's what we're doing. We're all in Zooms, sort of playing Hollywood squares, and we're not even aware. We're just filling content, and it's basically the beauty of a Zoom to me is that you can share eye contact and verbal exchange with people a lot better than if we were in a room together. I've done it for almost 2 years, and my events are better on Zooms than they are with people in a real room. And people hate to hear that, but I'm sorry, that's what I've experienced. And to take it even a step further, because you brought up language, let's try this one and then jump into John, can humans think without language?
I mean, I would say yes, but that, I mean, because you can think notes, and images. I mean, but I mean, we're so language is part of our communication, and it's how we communicate with ourselves as well. But I definitely say I do communicate, or I think things. I mean, with without language, images and sound. Yeah.
Good. Brian, can humans think without language?
I think so. I go back often to Nietzsche's The Birth of Tragedy, where when he looks at the early tragedians, there was very little human content in those tragedies, especially of Aeschylus. Most of the content in those plays had to do with the Greek chorus, and they were representative of the irrational, the primitive, and the natural world, for which humans, even when they do appear or when a conundrum appears before them, have little recourse to actually like alter the course of events. And so I think in our linguistic or our rational tendencies, we think we have understood or captured things more than perhaps we have. And I think, the more we can indulge in those non-linguistic territories, the closer we'll be to having an experience of nature and of the transcendence. I think so long as we're trying to codify everything in languages and in standards, we're missing a key component of being alive. Certainly, the attraction that I have as a documentarian and a curator and an art historian has been since I was young and before I even had a career could call myself that, something that I was drawn to. Particularly, John and I met through a shared interest in Brian Wilson's Unreleased Smile album from 1966-67, which for somebody who wrote some of the most recognizable and formulaic music of the early to mid 60s. And I don't mean that he didn't have any breakthroughs in the early to mid 60s as a writer of surf music. I just mean that it was so easily identifiable and replicable, and so many people did pastiche or cover or imitate the Beach Boys. For him to cut it up and dissect it into like little 10 to 30-second sections and try to move them around and add sound effects and grunts and chants almost seemed to me to be somebody who was playing around in the ineffable and the unstandardized. And so I've always been drawn to that in my life ever since then, because I've wanted to have one of those experiences where you were really out on the ledge and you were experiencing life without that kind of safety net. You were taking that ultimate risk. And so I think I do believe that there are ways of inventing new languages or breaking from language. I don't know exactly what you would call it, but I've had the pleasure of recognizing it ostensibly as it's come across my path in my life and going down those rabbit holes to discover those artists and those modes of thinking that are what I would call non-linguistic or experimental, certainly things that challenge our sense of stability and standardization. Well, which I would say Shonberg and Anger are two really, great modern examples.
Really well put. In Gary Snyder, the beat poet, said, poetry, the task of the poet is to see the world without language, then put that seeing into language. So a quick aside, have you guys both seen the trailer for the new Brian Wilson doc, or have you seen the doc?
No, I don't know that there is
Have you
one.
seen it? Have you seen it, Brian?
I saw the trailer. I actually think it comes out next week. It's called Long Promise Road,
Oh,
which is actually a Carl Wilson song, so I don't know why they applied that title.
okay, yeah. That's the only way I've heard of it. Yeah, is the title is not a Brian song. Yeah.
From what I understand, it's just the latest promotional piece. These documentaries about the Beach Boys or Pink Floyd or Fleetwood Mac or whatever, they come out every couple of years now, and they're basically like 2-hour infomercials for selling box sets or whatever.
Well, that's the history of documentary film. It's always a whitewash. So we're really looking forward to your film, Brian. Eden Abbott. Okay, so let's go into this. Peter Greenaway says that cinema is much too rich a medium to be left to storytellers. It's a visual art form, and basically all they've done is filmed plays for 120 years. You know what I'm saying? So you both are aware of experimental film, and experimental filmmakers are maybe doing something completely different or telling a story a different way. But how do you process that quote? We'll start with you, John, in regards to anger. Cinema is much too rich a medium to be left to storytellers.
Yeah. Well, I'm pretty familiar with the Greenaway, at least up to a certain point.
Yeah.
So it's a pretty interesting thing coming from him, because the more success it seemed like he got, he hit a stride, and then it was sort of down. Once he started, being more of a commercial filmmaker, I guess. I mean, it definitely applies to Anger's work. I mean, but it's still, I mean, you're still telling a story, I think, in some way. It's kind of like I was thinking about with the, language, thinking language. I mean, it's like sort of defining language too. I mean, you could say visuals are a form of language, or like I was talking about thinking in sound. I mean, sound is, music is math, and math is a universal language. So does that count as not thinking in language? Is it just another sort of way to, codify an abstract or something like that? And I feel with any cinema, it's you're kind of always telling a story with a film. It's just sort of, I mean, are people getting the story, I guess, or I mean, there's kind of an agreed upon, I'd say, language to cinema. And I mean, because in some ways, Kenneth Anger isn't really, I mean, his films, I guess, are kind of, they push boundaries, or did, but a lot of that language has been absorbed into, Scorsese or Lucas, or, I mean, it's just kind of become, the magic has become more the norm. It's been absorbed into other commercial things, and then it's not thought of as far out anymore. I mean, his color schemes, still show up, and I mean, even if they're not like huge, blockbuster films like Refn, or other Refn, he interviewed him, right? I mean, like he's acknowledged Anger's influence, like, with Drive and everything, which was a pretty big hit. I mean, so I mean, on the one hand, I see what Greenaway is saying, but I mean, even Greenaway's films tell a story. I mean, the Falls does tell a story. It's just really long, I guess. It's like,
Well, it's one of them. I think Andrew Noren said it, that if you just put one frame after another, then that's a linear
Yeah.
storytelling device.
Yes.
But if we watch Flicker, the Flicker by Tony Conrad, and it's just black and white flickering,
Yeah.
there's not really a story being told. But we, as the user, as the content, we might have a story go through our head. But it's
Yeah. Are you
interesting.
receiving the story? It's, you know, it's kind of, I mean, you're absolutely right. I mean, but you know, it's like, I mean, at a certain point, I mean, that's, you know, might give you a headache. I mean, is that the story? It's that, you know.
If that's a story, yeah. And it's fun because of all people, it'd be great to analyze Tony Conrad's motive, because it doesn't matter if the filmmaker wants you to understand this story. Once the artist makes their art, it's no longer theirs, it's the user. The user can do anything they want with it.
Mm-hmm.
So Brian, in your regard to, you could talk about anger too, but in regards to the painter you've so explored and helped expose to the world, thank you. Cinema is much too rich a medium to be left to storytellers. Any comment on that thought?
I don't really have a concern about this idea of like the storyteller versus the non-linear storyteller. For me, as a historian or a documentarian, like what I'm looking to do is pull people into kind of a living ecosystem where, as long as you're in it, the experience is one that feels very visceral. So when it comes to this idea of like experimental film versus you know, plays on a screen, when I was in film school, I absolutely hated any class where they actually taught us about storytelling devices, because I felt like everything that the teachers relied on were storytelling devices that at some point broke from the formula, but somehow they felt like they were permitted to judge our films based on these, you know, storytelling formulae that they were perceiving in things like Blade Runner or Citizen Kane or whatever. And I found that to be to put too many limits on my mind. But on the flip side, most experimental films that I watch, I'm not really that drawn into because they just seem a little bit pretentious to me. Kenneth Anger's work is different because I feel an incredible sense of humor and audacity, somebody who gives himself the kind of license to indulge in all kinds of glam and decadence, provocative imagery, and the worlds that he conjures are so all immersive that, you know, they only make sense sort of when you fall into them. So in my own world of being a creative historian and creating books or documentaries, that's really what I try to do. That's what I did with the Shonberg exhibition and catalog, was create a kind of living ecosystem where, as long as you were surrounded by the work, you felt like you were in this imaginary realm. And when you walked away from it, you know, that was no longer something that could be considered as sort of a storytelling advice or affectation. It was actually like leaving that universe. The same thing with my documentary about the songwriter of Nature Boy, Eden Abbey, who lived under the Hollywood sign in a sleeping bag and wrote many, many other songs in the 1940s through 60s. I don't have any talking heads in my documentary, which even for an experimental, you know, feature-length documentary like the recent Velvet Underground one, I liked what Todd Haynes did with a lot of the footage and the way he put this puzzle piece together. But ultimately, like every 5 minutes, there was somebody sitting in front of a bookcase telling you what to think. And I prefer to actually just start at the beginning and take someone deeper and deeper into this world where it almost becomes sort of like an initiation or something.
Yeah.
And by the end of it, you feel like you've actually walked through several gateways. You've had, sort of an illumination. And so anything less than that to me is just formula, whether it's experimental or whether it's traditional storytelling. And I'm not terribly interested in either. The experience, the breaking through, to a deeper level of expanded consciousness is what I'm drawn to in terms of subject matter. It's why I love Kenneth Anger and Burt Shonberg so much, and it's what I try to explore in my own work. If that makes sense.
It made a lot of sense, especially because it's high aspirations, and I appreciate it because too many people rely on the form that already exists, and then they're just focused on the content, and that's what Edgar Allan Poe did when he inspired the symbolist who spawned that whole thing, like Mallarmé's saying. It's how I want to make you feel. It's not so much the the product. And so that leads into the intention of the film, of the painter, or the intention of the filmmaker, the intention of the artist, the motive of the artist. John, I would like to ask you, do artists have a moral obligation?
I don't think so. I mean, to themselves, I guess whatever, but morals are, fluid, I suppose. So, I mean, I guess there's some lines that you think, shouldn't be crossed, but, there's a lot of things wind up going up against those, lines. I mean, all the time, so.
And that's like George Carlin said, comedy is drawing a line and then crossing it.
Yeah.
It's like nowadays, you're dead. Okay, Brian, do artists have a moral obligation?
They have an obligation to create a world that feels tangible and real. And if that touches up on things that matter to them of a moral nature, that's fine. But I think the real goal of actually creating is to pull people into, something that has a really wide network of ideas and influences, something that feels immersive, something that feels like it mirrors the actual experience of being in the world and trying to make sense of it from within. So morals, fine if that's your goal. I mean, The Realm of Man's Soul by John Bunyan feels very visceral as long as you're reading about that world. But and that's a very moral allegory. But and it worked for him. But I don't think that's necessary for every artist. So yeah, I guess no, not obligatory, but certainly if it compels the artist to create their realm or their imaginary world, then by all means.
Yeah, John, I wonder if you could suss out the word Lucifer, because I think people have, so much confusion over all these four words: Lucifer, Satan, devil, and pagan.
Mhm.
One of my favorites was Bob Guccione Jr. said the Catholic Church invented the devil as a marketing tool. And I says, that sounds right.
Yeah, that's about right. Yeah.
That's about right. But
Invented the horns and kept malevolence. Yeah.
and have you guys seen Penny Lane's film Hail Satan?
Mm.
Anyways, she's a pretty decent filmmaker, and it's very interesting how she tackles that term. But if you could suss out, because so many people have told me, oh, Lucifer is light bearer, fallen angel, but
Mhm.
then people think the devil is this and Satan is that, is suss out Anger's use of that word and maybe that theme, just to clarify.
Mhm. I don't know about the word, but the Lucifer as a concept, or even a being, is definitely like the fallen angel.
Sorry.
No, that's cool. Um, you know, um, uh, He is, yeah, Lightbringer. I mean, that's, and that links to cinema and, uh, the inner light. I mean, I don't know. Uh, I'm almost a little reluctant to talk about what
Yeah.
Lucifer is exactly. Hold on a second. So, like, am I breaking up there?
Nope, you're fine.
I'm fine. Okay. I think it means something like, I think it's something very personal to Kenneth. It's a very real, Lucifer is very real. I'd say to Kenneth Anger, and I mean it's a sacred thing. I think it's something very personal to him, um, or he is very personal to him, and
Yeah.
it's something he's spent his magic lantern cycle looking for. I don't think it's something you can separate from either those series of films, or even when it's not necessarily evident or apparent. Um, it's something like in all his work that's very real to him.
And I want you to weigh in, Brian, but just one more follow-up, John, is
Hmm.
what's the most Crowley is, would you agree Crowley is misunderstood in general? That he's just chalked off as this occult weirdo and that's it. I
Oh yeah.
mean, can you clarify a little there? Like, is he a philosopher, poet, painter who, why did it get to that point in any comment in that regard?
Yeah, I mean, I think he's definitely misunderstood, and I'm kind of hoping to do the same thing for Anger that Anger wanted to do for Crowley. Um, I mean, you could argue some of the, quality of Crowley's paintings or poetry, or at any given time, or his philosophies, but the core to Anger's work, it comes from Crowley, very specifically. Not just Lucifer Rising, but particularly some of the thoughts and ideas in Lucifer Rising. And I'd say he's misunderstood. I mean, "Do what thou wilt" is, I think, an incredibly misunderstood phrase or concept. I mean, because it doesn't mean there are no consequences for the things that you do. It just means that, really, when it comes down to it, we all have, one law that we follow, and that's like our internal, law we choose to do or to not do. And I mean, that it relates to magic as well,
Yep.
but Crowley did, push boundaries, like both in life and art, and he, he was run out of some places and did some funky things. So,
No, thanks for
speaking of moral, obligations.
moral obligation.
Yeah.
But Brian, any you want to weigh in on the word Lucifer or devil and that whole idea of why is Crowley misunderstood? Any comments?
It's a big subject. Lucifer originally comes out of the Gnostic tradition, where you have this dual idea of the creator. So you have the good creator and you have the bad creator. And in our experience of the physical realm, we're being kept captive by Yahweh, or the bad creator, and Lucifer is the bringer of light, in that it breaks that illusion of the judgmental God, and gives us access to a higher realm of consciousness, a Gnosticism which comes naturally through contemplation, knowledge, wisdom. Obviously, when the early Christians were attempting to set a standard dogma that would exist for the ecumenical church, they had to get rid of some of these fringe ideas that also emerged out of, like, experimental Judaism and the early, Christianity, and so Lucifer, as a key figure of Gnosticism, was easy to kind of pair up with the snake in the garden and the idea of Satan and the devil, and also in paganism, Pan, the horned god. But I think, all of them, by the time you get to the 20th century and you start having some of these experimental thinkers like Crowley or Anger or Schomburg or even Nietzsche, who referred to himself as the Antichrist, you're getting people who are willingly embracing this idea of the non-institutional as an emblem of their own willingness to break from tradition, to break from the institution, to be provocative. And so Lucifer, in the hands of Kenneth Anger and Aleister Crowley, and again Burt Shonberg, especially on images like this one, was sort of their badge of honor, their way of saying, like, we are not a part of the establishment, the Judeo-Christian status quo. Whether that was how Lucifer originally was seen back when that person or that symbolic figure became conflated with Satan and the devil, I don't really know. I haven't studied it closely enough. I mean, I've read some stuff and seen some videos, and I have some books on Gnosticism, but I'm not an expert on the etymology of Lucifer and how it got combined with Pan and Satan and the devil. I just know that its use by the 20th century had very much been combined in Christian and Judeo-Christian doctrine, and so the people who were adopting that were attempting to provoke.
I did think of something that I wanted to say that I am sort of comfortable saying about Lucifer in relation to Anger's work, is that he did kind of, he spoke of Lucifer as the bringer of light and a misunderstood angel and the fallen one, but in his own work, particularly Pleasure Dome, he will even humorously kind of evoke the other side of, in some of his interviews too, he'll kind of evoke the Christian concept of Lucifer as Satan, and there not being a division between the two, even though he generally would speak to the other concept of, Lucifer is, there's Crowley's Hymn to Lucifer, which was a big influence on the work, and the key to joy being disobedience being a concept of the poem and the film. There is also that sort of being interpolated into just the identity of Lucifer as being someone who is disobedient and a trickster, and someone who is there to be a Satan figure and to fool you, or even if to not lead you astray, they will trick you.
Yeah, and I would say that the New Age aspect of the modern concept of Lucifer tries to sort of remove the danger and the dark side of Lucifer that, as New Age practitioners especially feels like something that Christianity kind of placed onto it. And I think Schomburg also, by making Lucifer, sorry, I can't quite figure out how this is shown, but he's done basically like Pan, or he's colored like the Pied Piper of Hamelin. Mm-hmm. So the fool, the trickster, the prankster, as somebody who is able to transgress, the established way.
Transcendence through transgression, I think, is a theme. Yeah.
And that's also something that's very true of Crowley and his idea of Thelema, which is based on Rabelais. And this is also just, 17th century literature that's very much based on like transgression as a form of transcendence. Mm-hmm. So, a lot of that tricksterism, that provocation is kind of getting crystallized, I think, in these artists. And another thing is that in LA in the 1950s, with people like Anger and Cameron and Burt Shonberg and others, they sort of revive this idea of the Luciferians that was very common in the late 19th century in Paris with Lautréamont and Verlaine and Rimbaud and Baudelaire. There was an occult interest and also a social interest in breaking taboos, you know, and bringing some of these, you know, repressed aspects of culture out into the open. And they used a lot of the same kind of symbolism then. When it came to Los Angeles, it was a particularly conservative and repressive time to start bringing things like homosexuality and drugs and hallucinogens and sex magic out into the open. So, you know, they were putting themselves at considerable danger by exploring these ideas in such a public way through their media. But I think, you know, it's comparable in that way, even though it hasn't really, I don't think LA has been recognized as having that kind of like very radical culture in the 1950s. It's, you know, it's definitely apparent in these artists. Some recognition has been given to the artists that were surrounding Wallace Berman and the Ferris Gallery and things that were happening in Venice in the 50s with the assemblage artists. But I think, you know, Schomburg and Anger and people like that have, you know, maybe been seen more as anomalies and not necessarily seen as being emblematic of this, you know, very radical subculture that was bubbling up in LA. And maybe that more has to do with what happened after the Manson murders and how LA has, you know, made huge strides towards becoming kind of anti-radical, apolitical, sort of, you know, keeping its own self in check. I mean, I remember seeing an interview with Quentin Tarantino a few years ago on Joe Rogan, where he asked him, you know, what were you trying to do with Reservoir Dogs? And he said, I was just not trying to censor myself like everybody had been in the 80s, to sort of break that self-censoring. And I think that goes back to a lot of what we've been talking about with like these various ideas of formulas. You know, in a way, like it's so easy because it's become such an industry on so many different levels to, you know, even at a critical level, to think in these formulas because they're safe. They can actually take you from, you know, college to a career. And so to risk that, you know, it sounds like fun as like an intellectual or bohemian exercise. Like, yeah, we're great, you know, but it actually, you know, it undermines your ability to live a stable life. That if you can stay with it and find some sort of like acceptance within the culture where you can be funded and you can live with this way, it's great. But in the case of somebody like Kenneth Anger, other people have made much more money imitating his style of work than he has himself. And in the case of somebody like Schomburg, he died at the age of 44, completely forgotten, destitute. So I you know, breaking from the formula, breaking from tradition, while, you know, it's romantic to look back upon, I think the experience of it, Nietzsche as well, who we've spoken about, is a whole different story. And in a way, that is the story of Lucifer, I think, as it applies to ourselves. So,
Brian, that was well done because you inventoried all those symbolist poets from France well, and bringing in Rabelais is sort of the roots of Menippean satire, which is what Zappa was, a Menippean satirist. He taught me to embrace contradiction, you know, the angel and the devil, light and dark. And he even had what's the guy who did the music for Lucifer Rising? Bobby
Beausoleil, yeah.
Yeah, he was a backup singer on Zappa's first album, Freak Out. Do you guys know that?
I didn't. Is he in the?
Yes.
I'll my credits. Yeah.
Yeah. Anyways, just a couple more to wrap it up. This has been truly enlightening. John, what question, just name one question that remains unresolved for you in your studies of Lucifer Rising.
One question: how many versions there are? I mean, there's several I couldn't see because when I was working on the book, I found a bunch of prints of the movie, but I couldn't travel to see them because the pandemic hit. So I kind of had to rely on written, reviews from the time period, or that's my biggest concern. Sort of, it's just like capturing all the phases, because there's not just one. It's not like he was just working towards one final version, even though that's how he even talked about it. Is like there's several versions of a lot of his movies, and the final version is generally the one that's he would consider the most valid. But they're all, like they all kind of exist for him. They all mark different points in his life, how he looked at the movies. And I mean, even on his home video, they did put out the 2 versions of Rabbit's Moon, and it would be great someday to see like a real collection of all these different versions of the films. Some of them are just have different soundtracks, but with Lucifer Rising, these cuts they're very different. I mean, they're remarkably different. And I mean, you can kind of see there's a very early version that people keep putting up on YouTube that you can go see on YouTube with the Jimmy Page soundtrack. But that version of the film, I'm assuming or presume, is the very first version with Page's soundtrack, because it actually like basically the same image went with the Pink Floyd's Adam Hart Mother was its soundtrack. And then he kept reworking the version with Page's soundtrack. And I know there are at least 3 different versions with the Page soundtrack. And they seem to have gotten more towards what was eventually released with the Beausoleil soundtrack. And I don't know if there are longer versions. He kept talking about at least a version that was 40 minutes. It was supposed to be 93 minutes long. And there are no known versions of the film that even approach half of that length. But he kept talking about it as a feature film, and it never made it to that, as far as I know. But somewhere out there, or somewhere in there, in some vault, possibly UCLA, like there could be a work print, that's at least 40-45 minutes.
Wow, well done. And Brian, name one question that remains unresolved for you in your study of Burt and his paintings.
So in 1960 and 61, Burt underwent a number of supervised experiments of LSD 25 with Dr. Oscar Janiger, and he documented a lot of these experiments and experiences in real time in a book sort of a graphic novel or a comic strip that he titled Out Here. And it was his way of really looking for language to explain what it is that he experienced. The book was originally in the possession of his roommate, LeDrew Shootman Baker III. They both lived together in Seal Beach for many years. And LeDrew had the book when I knew him in the early 2000s. And then LeDrew died in 2007, and the book has since been split up. Part of it is in the possession of Marshall Burrell, who was a friend of Burt's and LeDrew's in the late 60s and through the 70s. Marshall was also the manager of the band Love and the band Spirit, and early manager of Van Halen. But the other half has conspicuously gone missing, as has the rest of Burt's portfolio, with which LeDrew had. And so I've heard some rumors that some unsavory figures from the underworld of Las Vegas have gotten a hold of it. I don't know how true that is. I've had a really hard time tracking down anybody who was associated with LeDrew. Some of them I knew, and so we basically have the first half of Out Here, which is about the initial experiences, but we're
Is
missing.
that where the album comes from? The title? I mean, I presume.
Yeah.
Yeah, I didn't know that. Yeah.
Yeah, so Arthur Lee bought a painting called Out Here by Burt Shonberg in
Okay.
1965 and put it on the cover of the 1969 album of Love. But the title that actually comes from this manuscript that Burt was creating. And in Spencer Kans's biography about Burt Shonberg, I think there's a claim that he actually worked on these drawings from 1960 to 65. I never saw any evidence for that myself. I think they were mostly probably done between 60 and 61 when he was having those LSD experiences. But to me, those are a treasure. And as somebody who really was one of the first to invent a language for the psychedelic experience, much before, Stanley Mouse or Rick Griffin or those kind of icons of California psychedelic art, Schomburg was, a decade or more ahead of them. And this was kind of like the crystalline or the azimuth, moment in his creation of work under the influence. So that was a big, a big question for me. But there are others. There's a lot of mystery still surrounding this artist.
Yeah, and people can contact both of you through your websites, which are listed there, and get much more information. So in closing, I just want to say it's been really fun being on live TV. This is a retrieval of live TV. Just imagine what Ernie Kovacs was doing back then. We're doing it right now. And it reminded me of my days in public access TV, which was the same thing. We could do live TV shows for free. The government said, hey, we're going to give people availability to the airwaves. And sadly, public access is now gone, but we do have this format, and it's been fun, gentlemen. I really appreciate it. My public access show was called Better Beyonds, and I really believe this was a retrieval of that. This was Betterly Beyond. So the last question is, John, what is beyond?
Ooh, what is beyond? You keep asking me these questions that I can't easily jump to. I mean, anything that's out there, right? I mean, so like something that's outside of your known area. There's, you could say comfort level, but just like what is known, because like, yeah.
I like that.
Yeah.
Go ahead, Brian. What is beyond?
Well, beyond is what we in the Buddhist tradition would call the unified field of all consciousness. It's the place that is without the illusion of separation. Yeah,
that sums it up well. Yeah, McLuhan said a fun thing. He said, communication of the new is a miracle, but it's not impossible. So you've definitely proved it to me. I've learned a lot new, and I really appreciate both of you tonight. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Thanks, Jerry. All right.
Pushing that over and out button.